This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host, researcher and entrepreneur, Olli Tikkanen.
Before we start today's episode, we would like to ask for your help. Dr. Scott McNamara at the University of Northern Iowa is conducting a study to examine what motivates podcast creators and podcast listeners within the field of physical education. They also seek to understand how a community of learners is cultivated using this medium. They are looking for participants, and since you are listening to our podcast today, you are a potential participant. To participate in the study, you need to be creating physical education podcast or be a listener. This study involves completing an online survey, which will take about 5 minutes. After completion of the survey, you will be asked to provide your email so that they can ask you to participate in a 45 minutes long interview. So if you're interested, please use the link in the episode description to complete the survey. This would help in developing new knowledge and the value and benefits of podcasts for individuals and communities. Thanks for your time. Welcome everyone. I'm very excited about the forthcoming episode as we are talking about physical education, and I get to discuss with the fellow Science Comms podcaster, as our guest is the host of podcast called Playing with Research in Health and PE. Our guest has done his bachelor and master's in California State University in kinesiology with emphasis on sports psychology, and has done his Doctor of Education at Columbia University. Currently, he is working as an assistant professor at the George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, U.S. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce our guest, Dr. Risto Marttinen. Welcome, Risto.
Thanks, Olli.
So if we move to podcasting, and you have had a couple of years at least the podcast, how and why did you got into podcasting?
I wanted to do something that, I got into podcasting. I listened to a ton of podcasts, and I wanted to get to a point where, so doing something for my students, right? So my students have limited time in their days. They have all these other classes. I want them to read research. So if I give them a 28-page research article that's read or that's written to be read by people who have PhDs, they're not going to understand all of it, right? They're not going to understand the, theory behind it or the methods because they haven't had a theory or a research methods class. But still, the findings are really important. So my goal was to start the podcast and to make 20 to 25 minute episodes and have these 20 to 25 minute episodes where the author explains their paper in that short period of time. So even if my students didn't do any reading, on their way to campus, they can put it in their car or their headphones when they're taking the metro over to campus, that they can listen to and understand enough about that research to then have an intelligent conversation going forward. And I kept the episodes to 20 to 25 minutes for probably the first year. And then I realized it was too hard. And I just enjoyed talking about the research. So they've gotten longer. Maybe I'm too long-winded, but it was for that. So it was one for my students to bridge that gap. 2, for practitioners who can't afford to read a research article that gets published behind a paywall that costs $40 for somebody to buy. And 3, for other scholars. I know when I was at Cal State Fullerton teaching a bunch of classes, doing research, I had a hard time keeping up with research. And for me to be able to provide, we do a podcast episode every Tuesday, launches at 7 a.m. Eastern. So for researchers out there, for early career scholars in their downtime, when they're folding laundry or when they're going for a run or driving to and from work, that they can catch up on one more research article every single month, or every single week they get one more article. That's beneficial to them, let alone the early career scholars that we try to get on, who are, in their first jobs. They need a little bigger platform to be able to communicate their work with. I think it's just a win-win-win all around.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think it's just such time efficient for the listener and also creation, that if we would, for example, try to write a blog post or an article of these things that we have discussed now, it would take so much more time.
Mm-hmm.
And then people would need to read, so it would take away for their time. But when it's in audio format, so I think it's a really good format, and I think researchers should use it more. How has the feedback been from the students? Have they been listening it a lot?
So when we launched the podcasts, I started putting them into my classes, and they really enjoyed them. And I don't know if they enjoy every single one of them. I think all of them have been awesome, but I don't know if that goes through to all of my students. But I know that they have given me feedback that the podcasts are way more fun than having to sit down and read a 28-page research paper. So in the weeks that I don't assign a podcast, I put a podcast on our learning management system. We use Blackboard. I put a podcast that's related to that issue, because I know that out of 30 students in my class, maybe 3 are really, really interested in doing the extra work. And I know that I can kind of cultivate a research understanding with those students. So I think it's been well received. We've had a huge bump this year. I think partially because people are telling people. And I think that bump is because professors are putting them in their classes, and they're having them do required listening or supplemental stuff. And so now I'm kind of seeking out more scholars that do things that help other scholars. So like I had Tristan Wallhead, who's an expert on this curriculum model called Sport Education Model. I said, hey, can you just do these solo explanations of this curriculum that you've been studying for 15 years? And so then I can put those on, and they end up having, shorter podcasts throughout. And, we've increased kind of the styles that we do. We do an article club, which I don't know if you do on this podcast, but I found that really engaging. I have, 5 scholars who I know personally, and we just go off and off with one person picks up article, everybody reads it, no script, no lead up questions, just we get on and talk about it. And we post the article on Twitter, so people who want to go in and read the article, then they can listen to other people's kind of conversation about it. I've loved that format, in addition to breaking down these specific research articles as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. We don't do, at least yet, article club. So how do you do it in practice? How many you are, and do you do it live or now probably online? And is somebody leading the talk, or could you tell about the practicalities?
Yeah, and I know that because I tried to find kind of hashtags on Twitter, so I know that other people do this in different fields. Like there's a archaeology article club and other things. But basically, we send out an article with a couple weeks heads up. We schedule a time through Doodle to get everybody on the same page. We lock it in, and then I send a Zoom invite for those people. And basically, we've expanded it. It used to be 3, and then we've expanded it to 5, maybe 6. And you just join if you want to read the article, right? Most people like doing this. So most people come in every single week, but, getting 6, people who teach in higher education to get the same day off is super tough, right? So, some people are really busy. They'll skip one, they'll come back on the next one. So we just need about 3 people minimum to do it. So I expanded it to 6 so people can kind of fall off and fall in. And then we just get on. And I always say that the first question is to the person who picked the article. And I say, why did you pick the article? And the next question is, what's your overall opinions from all other people? And, you take notes, and I have some leading questions if nobody else has leading questions, just as a backup. Sometimes I get to my points, sometimes I don't. We go about 30 to 50 minutes, depending on the article. And yeah, it's been good. I think it caught some people off guard in the beginning when I posted, "Oh, I'm doing this article," and people are like, "Wait, do you want me to be on the podcast, or do you need me to do anything?" I'm like, "Oh no, we're just going to talk about your article publicly," which is, I guess, weird, but people have been really, really good about it. It does, give their article another kind of bump up. People might read it more, cite it more. So,
Yeah, I like the idea, and I think in general podcasting it's quite uniform, the formats now, that usually it's one host who's either talking alone or 2 hosts who are discussing, or it's a host and a guest and they talking, and it's quite formal in a way. And I think when somebody, for example, have studied one subject for 30-40 years, even the discussions they are having in a coffee table in the university cafeteria are probably interesting for some people. Yeah. So I think researchers should be just recording more things, like when they have, for example, research groups. It's probably interesting information for quite many people who are in the same niche or doing same kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is getting a couple people in the room and just throwing out a topic can be, if done well, can be some of the best podcasts, of, like you said, a person that's been in that field for 20 years, or maybe has had the life experience in 5 years of a person who's been in the field for 25 years. Getting them to have a conversation, like I would listen in.
Yeah, I agree.
For most sedentary behavior and physical activity researchers, collecting the research data is one of the most frustrating steps of a project, especially as inefficient data collection steals too much of your precious time, causes unnecessary stress and hassle, and can easily derail progress of your project. This is why we devised a revolutionary new way to collect data, introducing Fibion Sense Motion, the beginning of a new era. Fibion Sense Motion is a cutting-edge, next-generation system that allows you to easily and remotely collect, store, and manage data. Our solution features a tiny, waterproof device that captures the sedentary behavior and physical activity data, a mobile app for automatic uploading of the data from the device, and a cloud service for managing the data. Even better, all collected data is GDPR compliant, and you have access to automatically analyzed variables of activity types and raw 3-axis accelerometer data. Don't compromise on the quality of your research or the project timeframes. Discover the convenience and power behind our solution at sense.fibion.com. That is SENS.Fibion.com. Fibion, created by researchers for researchers.
And how do you see now that with the pandemic we have moved to distant teaching, and you have used podcast already in your teaching? How do you see the modern teaching? For example, is it better to do lectures, or is it better to do them podcasts? It's easier to consume, and how do you see, where is the teaching going with these new formats and new technologies?
So I think podcasts are one avenue. I don't think they're the only avenue. I don't think every student loves podcasts. It's very hard to take notes on podcasts because we talk about how convenient it is. And so a lot of students feel like it's super easy to do, but then are they really taking all that information in? Maybe not. Maybe it's very hard for them to pay attention during that. So I think that and so how I have my classes set up is a lot of times they have some sort of blog, some sort of podcast, and some sort of online lecture, and then we either meet in person or we have some sort of discussion board. But in a classroom environment, right? If I'm physically in a classroom in front of my students, I'll say, you have to listen to the podcast before you walk into class. And then that leads into discussion. And then that leads into a more robust discussion about what that podcast highlighted. So I think podcasting to me, and I'm not sure if this is to everybody, but it's a vehicle to get into a better discussion, a more rich discussion. It's like underlying, and then we talk about how that, relates to those students' lived experiences of what they feel like their goals are in that class or their opinions are in that subject. And so I don't think podcasting is the only way. And, we run a doctoral seminar through the podcast through University of Northern Colorado in Greensboro. And Dr. Ben Dyson had this idea of like, hey, what do you think? I'm doing this pedagogy podcast or pedagogy seminar, and I'm going to record every single one. We're going to have 14 guest lectures over the semester, and I'm going to record them. Can we upload them on your podcast? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And I think they're popular, episodes to listen to, but that person who's listening can't interact, right? They can't interact and talk to specific people and ask clarifying questions. So it's still not as interactive as a class is. And I think that there are different organizations that do this really well. And that's probably why they charge for them, and have live Q&A where you can actually just like sit on a call and do a live Q&A after you get done talking, or somebody posts a question in a chat to kind of guide that direction forward. And maybe podcasts will get there, that you can do live recording and people can go online and they know when you're recording, or you record at the same time every day, you do it live and the chat is open for people to chime in. I mean, it would be a more robust educational experience, but I don't know. I love it. I think it's allowed me to read well beyond what I traditionally would have read. Every person that comes on is really interesting, so I have a great time doing it. So.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe some of the listeners they are working as educators or researchers, and they might be thinking of podcasting. What would you like to say to them, and what kind of tips or encouragement you'd like to give for them?
I think so. The things that I was told in the very beginning, which I think are really great, is you got to stay consistent. Right? You got to stay consistent in publishing at a regular rate. So it's really easy to put out and gather 5 episodes and put them out all at once because you're so excited because you just like created this thing. But to hold them out, if you're going to do a podcast once a month, do a podcast once a month. If you're going to do it once a week, do it once a week. And for a long time, like it just will stay stale, right? It's not going to just like rocket. At least for me, it's not going to rocket through the roof in your first 3 episodes, but it's building an audience through that. And look, like if you like doing it, then you just keep doing it. There's no reason for you to stop, even though your listenership isn't in the thousands or hundreds of thousands. But something that you enjoy doing, and that's why it was easy for me to continue doing this, even though our listenership wasn't like skyrocketing, was because I knew that it would help my students, because I was going through and we were able to, I was able to have essentially guest lectures without having them scheduled. And to, the other goal for us is to really have this like living library that will stay for as long as this podcast app. So as long as Spotify is around, like people are able to talk to people or listen to people talk about their work. And so I think it's just going out. I use Anchor, which I found, and this is not a paid plug for Anchor, but I found it really easy. I record, I drop my information into Anchor. It uploads it into 11 different podcast sites. I schedule my podcasts in advance. Like I record and I set my launch dates. So right now, my last recording that I did yesterday will come out in 6 weeks. So I try to get ahead of it. I know, we don't talk about everyday things. Like I don't talk about like, oh, yesterday it was this and this or this date. So they are kind of timeless in a way, so they can be listened to 2 years from now. So it doesn't matter if I launch it tomorrow or if I launch it in 6 weeks. I just try to kind of stay ahead of it and continuously, put out an episode every Tuesday at 7 a.m. It drops like clockwork. And I think that helps listeners kind of get into the rhythm of listening.
Yeah, I think good points. Consistency, and then if you enjoy doing it, it's easy to keep on going and building a buffer first that you can skip a couple of weeks without recordings and still you keep getting the episodes out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would say the same, that it's, of course, there's a learning curve in the beginning how to record proper quality audio and so on, but publishing with these services that you can use, which usually cost like just $10 a month, it's surprisingly easy, and you just upload it there and it goes everywhere, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. So I think it's easier than people usually think.
Yeah, and setting up my recording, because I used to record through GarageBand. I had an external mic, learning to run that and like basically to get started with free GarageBand and an external mic, it took me a very long time, to figure out the audio settings and all of this. And I was having issues recording, through Zoom or Skype, and have to figure out the microphones and stuff. So I actually wrote down all these directions on how to do it. But I think that there are programs now that are just like a click and play. And that's Anchor is one that it's just like, just click. You can even do it on the app. Just hold down the record button and go. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that it's way easier than people think if you have a little bit of understanding. And if you enjoy doing it, then you don't really care how many people are listening.
Yeah, I agree. I've been now changing places for several reasons. So I'm always like getting the reverb and echo away. Mm-hmm. So I now have like a lot of pillows in front of me, and behind me I have blankets and so on. So that's maybe one thing, just to get the echo away, and then even not so expensive microphone will give decent sound quality. So I think that's the one thing that you need to pay attention to get the quality sound. I think we could start finishing, but maybe last one. How do you see the role of podcasting in science communications now and in the future?
Well, I would be interested to find out more about this. I know a colleague of mine, Scott McNamara, runs an adapted physical education podcast, and he's done research on this, and I think it's interesting research. It's about adapted physical educators' attitude about educational podcasts, and I think that it has such a huge opportunity. Like, it has so much possibility. I don't know how it's going. Like, I don't know how to do a research project. One of my guests talked about was, having a student read a research paper and then having them listen, or other group having them listen to a podcast, and seeing which one actually understood more or engaged more with it. And I don't know how to put that into action, but that's what I would be interested in, is to see if does what you and I do, like, is it actually something that they are learning from, or is it really nice background sound when are they going to get one thing out of a 40-minute podcast? And maybe that's good. But do they actually, for like us, when we do article overviews, do they get the main ideas out of that article? I think that would be the interesting to see. And if we can show that there is actually and there are other, I think in social services or public health, there's some research out on podcasts that have shown a positive effect on there. But I think a lot of those are attitudes. Do students like it? Well, yeah, students enjoy podcasts, or they're good podcasts and they're good additions. But did they learn? Was it educational for them? Did it actually have the meaning that we wanted it to? And I think that's the next step.
Yeah, that's a good question. And when you start podcasting, you see the numbers, how many people listen to the episode, but usually in the beginning you get absolutely no feedback. You don't know who listened. You see what countries people listened, but basically you get really little feedback, and it's kind of a little bit difficult. Like, you don't know who's listening. Did they only listen like the first minute and they quit? So it's, in the beginning, it's a little bit challenging. Then later on, you start to get feedback and hear a little bit, at least, from people how it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're right on. It's the beginning parts is, okay, so this many people listen to it from these places, but I have no idea who those people are. Is it just some person, I don't know, in a different country trying to learn English, and they stumbled on your podcast and they're listening to it? Or, I think it took me 2 years until other scholars really have said, hey, this is a really good service to the community. Like, thanks for doing that. And I use it in my classes. I'm like, please tell me if you use this in your classes, because that's really helpful for me. But I don't know. I think it's an exciting space to be in. And for me, it's great because I get to have so many great people on the podcast that are really intelligent, talk about really interesting content, and are willing to give me an hour of their day to just chat with me. I mean, who am I? I'm just some random guy who lives in Virginia that does research in this area and wants to talk research. So
yeah, I fully agree with you. It's always a pleasure. You get to discuss for an hour with really clever people who have a long experience. So I would recommend doing podcast even for that. So how do people find your podcast, and which episodes you would recommend people to listen first?
If you go on Twitter and you look at the HPE podcast, there's a link there. So health and physical education. So at the HPE podcast. We also have a website, www.thehpewebsite.com, and it links there as well. And you can go into the website version if you don't have a podcast app, or you want to assign students podcasts. I think that there are a bunch of different ones. I don't know if I can pick the best ones there. I think it's we have a couple of different styles of podcasts. One is a theory breakdown, which are pretty quick. They're great to kind of get an overview on intersectionality or theory of planned behavior or socio-ecological theory or things like that you may know a little bit, but you need a refresher. You can just listen to a couple of those. The article clubs are enjoyable to me. It's more conversational. We also put up, and these may not be for everybody, but we also put up audio from the Pt3 Collaborative, which is the teacher education collaborative that has about anywhere between 75 to 150 college professors on a call talking about key issues in teacher education. So we put up the audio for that. And then we also put up the audio for ICEP monthly connection with colleagues conversations. So I'd say the top listened to episodes are Laura Alfrey talking about the Australian curriculum, Ash Casey in our second episode about models-based practice, the ICEP conversation somewhere in the 90s about Joe Wicks, which is a really interesting phenomenon in the UK, that basically this personal trainer became the face of physical education teaching in the UK. So I'd say those are three good ones to kind of understand the different formats, but those are just the top episodes. And again, like you said, I have no idea why those are the top episodes. I know those people are active on social media, but I don't know. Maybe it's because it's episode 2 that Ash Casey came on and people go through systematically when they look at it. So.
Yeah. So especially if you're working on PE, go and check the podcast. And please leave some comments, whether it's negative feedback, positive, whatever, how you use the podcast, what did you like, what would you wish to have there. It would help us a lot as a podcasters if we get some more feedback. It can be anything, but it helps us because now we really don't know how people like it and how they use it. So check out the podcast of Risto, and I would like to thank you for taking the time for this podcast. It was a really, really nice recording, and I think there's a lot of valuable information for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't be able to do this podcast stuff without the people who support me. I have an undergraduate assistant and a PhD student who kind of helped me out in getting questions together and setting that stuff up. I have a couple colleagues who help recruit and do some questions as well. So I thank you so much for having me on, and good luck on your podcast as well.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.